Hello, good evening. If you're joining us from Europe, good afternoon here on the East Coast. Good morning to those like Isabel on the West Coast. It is a bright and sunny day here in Washington, a great day to be inside having a conversation about storms and risks. So before we get into all of that, I'm going to kick off our session with a brief video and then be back on the other side. So let me start there. Read the report. It's out this morning. Some really interesting findings, both about the risks, the reputational risks facing foundations, the philanthropic sector, but also the regular now installment of risks we're tracking. And we'll get into those in just a second. Before I pass it over to Isabel for her observations and key takeaways from the report, I want to introduce our moderator for this afternoon's session. Stacy Palmer's the CEO of the Chronicle of Philanthropy. We're really glad to have you and your perspective with us, as well as Abba Blackson, who is the Chief Communications Officer at the NAACP. Really looking forward to your takes on the index and what you're seeing. But Isabel, as usual, we've now been at this a year. Your observations, what's important, what's sticking out to you?
Thank you so much, Brett, and I'm so glad to be joined here with Stacey and Abba as well. This has been an incredible journey as we've seen the Reputation Risk Index really reflect the challenges in the marketplace. And I think quarter one, 2020 to 26, sort of continues that standard that we've been seeing of this rapid acceleration of AI and its impact across the board, and this continued political volatility, the macroeconomic situation that we're in right now as well. And all of that uncertainty, undergirded by the fact that the rules are changing. The rules are changing in terms of how we're operating in society because of AI and technology, but as well just because of the political upheaval. And so I'm really excited for this conversation as we focus on philanthropy. We know that philanthropy, nonprofits, our foundations in particular, have had to monitor the challenges that we've seen in the marketplace, with such clarity, because their missions are so focused on so many of the issues that are under attack, whether that's climate change or DEI, racial justice, all of these issues that have in the U.S. become so volatile are now being protected by our foundations, our philanthropy sector. And so it's exciting to have this conversation. We saw for the first time that AI misuse led us. That this is the number one risk on the chart. We also saw that the number three risk, data breach, had its first appearance. And so it's really an interesting time, and I look forward to diving into the details.
And that's an interesting bridge because we just heard from Anthropic. In fact, there was an emergency meeting called for Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, as well as Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, talking about the potential that this next generation of Anthropic's technology has to breach even the most supposedly secure cyber defenses. And I think that question of, for a while, going back now 12 years since I left the Obama White House, we've been talking about it's a question of if and not when. And so whether it's philanthropy, whether it's corporations, understanding how you prepare for that moment of when there is a data breach, when you do face a disinformation attack, which was another one of those top risks. For me, the key headline from this was really, a failing grade. And Stacey, I'm being a little bit provocative here, so then I'll toss it in your direction. But a failing grade for a lot of philanthropies when it came to how they responded to this moment. And when we're saying this moment, I think it's important to put into context, it's not just the US political environment. There's a lot of political pressures around the world. And as I've seen going back and forth across the Atlantic, at times they're polar opposite pressures. And that you're not seeing, and we talked to a number of European foundations and folks across the continent there who equally feel as though there has not been a rising to this moment, to the threats that some of the principles on which organizations are founded, the programs that for so many years have been so valuable, and that was too quickly in many instances abandoned or put under wraps to try and avoid some of that political scrutiny, in some cases legal scrutiny. And so I think there really is a question that organizations are wrestling with right now after 1 year of Trump, after obviously just a lot of upheaval in the last few years, of how well did we do? How do we do things differently going forward? And I know it's something top of mind for a number of clients around, as we've seen the U.S. Attorney General, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security leave, and probably more departures, it sounds like, in the coming weeks or months. What does that change in terms of the U.S. administration's approaches to some of these policy priorities, to some of these threats? And then globally, how are we seeing as countries have adapted, adjusted to this new world order? And we sit here in the midst of a Strait of Hormuz that is blocked off, blocking 20% of the U.S., or rather the world oil supply. All of these, I think, put a lot of pressure on how organizations operate. So those are our quick takes off the top. Stacey, I'm virtually handing the baton in your direction.
Great. And I'm so glad to have Abba, Brett, and Isabel to talk about what this report means, and so appreciate the fact that philanthropy was considered in this reputation area, because we are in a really new world for philanthropy. Philanthropy usually is seen as the good guys, the ones fighting for justice. And I think certainly in most administrations, even if they didn't necessarily pay a lot of attention to philanthropy publicly, you didn't have the kind of denigration we've had, lawsuits, a lot of high stake politics. It certainly has put philanthropies and nonprofits on edge. Many nonprofits have been fighting back, taking the Trump administration to court and often winning. But still, it's a really challenging time. And I think as context, one of the things that's important for us all to think about is philanthropy has never been really terrific at telling its own story. Often, philanthropy wants to have the grantees have the spotlight. Nonprofits themselves don't have a lot of resources to focus on storytelling. They want to go do their program. They don't necessarily want to do all of this work to educate the public, but that's had a price, because the public doesn't necessarily know or understand how nonprofits and foundations work. And now, when there's so much of an attack, we're seeing that come to roost. So I'd really love to have the perspective of what you're seeing about how nonprofits and foundations are thinking about reputation and risk. Abba, can I talk to you first about what are you seeing on the ground? How are people changing their thinking about things, and what has been the response been?
Well, first of all, thank you. I am so glad we're having this conversation. I am really appreciative of the Global Situation Room and the for putting this report out quarterly. I think it is important that we sort of see around the corners and see what is coming. I think in our roles, it is especially now critical that we help our organizations think beyond today. The political whiplash is real. And I think what I am seeing is the key word of the moment is really trust. And trust in that at a moment for philanthropy where you say, we stand for this. When that is challenged, do you actually stand for that, or do you sort of capitulate? And at a moment where I think corporate America sort of abdicated its leadership, there was a moment for philanthropy to sort of stand in and say this is what doing good looks like at a critical time. And I think what the report is showing is that philanthropy could have done better. Philanthropy was caught a little bit flat-footed. And I think there is recognition now that there's a place for philanthropy in whatever the next iteration of um, uh, this sort of current political climate looks like across the world. And so what can philanthropy do in this moment? As you're saying, sometimes it is tell a better story. But the story is not it. You have to live you have to live your values. I think that is what the report is actually showing. Living your values and making sure that what you are saying, what you're doing is aligned to what people are seeing you do in a moment. And so I think for this conversation, there's as we think about how we move forward, there's a level of clarity and a level of courage, dare I say, that is needed from leadership across all levels and across all, whether it's corporate or philanthropy or organizations. I think there's a leadership vacuum on so many levels, a leadership vacuum. Can we just say that? And so the folks that will really help us in this moment is those who are standing on values and standing on principles and leading with courage.
Courage is absolutely the operative word there. Isabel, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. Well, I always try to remind myself as well, especially having focused on small businesses most of my life, that the majority of nonprofits are small businesses. My understanding is that, almost two-thirds of them have budgets that are just under $50,000, or these numbers better than me. And then almost all of them have, budgets under five. So we're really talking about small entities that are having to respond in this moment at scale and really represent communities. So I respect that. I understand how challenging it is, and I understand that there's also an opportunity for great innovation and for being creative, as they are known to be as well. So I think that Abba really reflected it well, that it is a moment when value alignment, protecting the mission to deliver, so that you're respected and trusted in the community and seen as a thought leader is something that nonprofits and foundations really have to focus on. And I think that the constant flipping, the uncertainty has made it more challenging, but I do remember that it's oftentimes these small nonprofits, just like it was small businesses that went after the federal government on tariffs. It's this David and Goliath story in many cases where you have folks stepping up and really working to defend where is you don't necessarily have that in the corporate sector. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I really appreciate the challenge that philanthropy and nonprofits have right now. I mean, data breach, as well as AI, obviously are in our top three risks. But we're all challenged right now to start collecting data more. You can't have an agentic enterprise unless you have the data from which AI can then automate. And so but at the same time, you're trying to protect your data from the federal government in the U.S. in this case, oftentimes, and prevent misuse of your data. And so, I appreciate that, there are more layers of challenges when we're talking about data breach, when we're talking about, protecting data and mission for nonprofits in particular.
Absolutely. Brett, what are you seeing?
Well, I would offer just some practical advice. Over the last year, watching organizations prepare for, and in some cases, respond to these threats, what I have wished for, what I've wanted is more to step forward and say, Mr. President, Secretary so and so, political group X or Y, so glad that you raised this issue. Let us tell you why we do our work, why it is important, and also not falling into the context, often, an incorrect and inaccurate context that is created by the administration or by that, political actor, but instead, to go out we equipped to have the debate on your terms and to zoom out in many cases where there'll be an issue, pick your hot button issue, whether it's on gender or race or LGBTQ issues, and say, you know what? Let's actually have a discussion on questions of equality, on questions of access, on questions of opportunity. And if you are prepared to have that discussion, one of the things that we found, and this goes even back to my days on the National Security Council. I mean, I remember working in response to the kidnapping of the schoolgirls in Chibok, Nigeria. And there was so much outrage, so much concern, but it also had to be channeled in such a way. And we created this Let Girls Learn initiative to really serve as a rallying point to generate more resources, more support for girls' education. And that sent a message to Boko Haram, other groups, that if you engage in these kind of tactics, it actually is going to catalyze communities. It's going to catalyze support. And so, again, in the really pragmatic recommendation space, I would say groups over the past year ought to look at how can we be better prepared when the spotlight is shown upon us to engage in that debate, not to shy away from it, not to have the conversation in the context it's created, but really to push out into a space that it can be much more constructive.
Great suggestion. I'm curious, Abba, in your job, how does this affect things day to day? Are you constantly dealing with some new threat, some new accusation? And how do you work with the colleagues at your organization to figure out how you're going to respond?
So I think one of the things that is important is sort of scenario planning and not shying away from that.
Yeah.
On some level, there are many possible scenarios, especially in this climate and context. But I think as an organization, you know the work that you need to do. You know the policies that you want to enact, right? Or the desired outcomes, if you will. And so just thinking through the exercise of thinking through, if A happens, how then will we respond? If B happens, how then will we respond? And not only doing the scenario planning, but also having a number of stakeholders at the table, whether that is legal or policy or any number of different organizations or divisions across the organization. I think sometimes when we look at threats sort of in the myopic, sort of siloed, if a problem comes, we will tackle it. You are often caught unprepared to deal when the moment comes. And so I think for a lot of organizations, the work is actually planning and preparing. And as we sit here today, there will be an election in a couple of months. There will be an election in a couple of years. There will be outcomes to those elections. What are you going to do regardless of the outcome? Right? There will be an outcome. And so I think what this index signals is whether it's the AI misuse or the misinformation, or there's work to be done regardless of the political sort of climate. The climate is informative, but as philanthropy, as a nonprofit organization, you must move your agenda forward, right? You must move your agenda, and you know what those things are, and you know who is able to help you move that agenda. And so identifying that, and to Brett's point, having the conversations, and thinking about, okay, so here's a threat. How would we respond to that? And how can we leverage this moment to sort of better prepare our, not only our message but our actions, our behavior, and how will we respond, and how will we engage all stakeholders to leverage this moment to actually drive our agenda forward. So I think for us, it is not easy. It is not easy because every day there are things that you feel like you need to respond to. But when you're prepared, you actually have a rubric or a framework for what are the things that we actually respond to. Because responding to everything in every minute in all ways is sort of counter to your mission. And so having some plan, or having some guide as to here are the things that we actually need to respond to from our lane, from our sort of clear organizational position and voice. When you do that, I think it makes the work a little bit easier in this very noisy climate.
Is there an example of a response you did that because of all of that planning, you really saw it pay off that you can share with us?
So last week the
Probably lots, but
NAACP.
if you had to pick one to just illustrate.
Well, so last week the NAACP called on the administration, the leadership, to actually invoke the 25th Amendment.
Mm.
And we had this is something that we had been working on. We talked about, when will be the right time to make the call. And quite frankly, some people say, well, the alternative is not that much better. Relative to DEI or anything else that the NAACP may be working on. But that is not actually the full point. The full point is we need to deal with this moment in our strongest voice. And for us, we thought that was the thing that we needed to do at the time, based on our planning and based on our internal conversations, including legal policy and other actors.
Oh, that's a great example. Isabel and Brett, I am curious as you look at nonprofits and foundations and you work with them, are there things that you've seen them do that really stand out as exemplary that you'd like to encourage others to do, and any specific examples in particular areas? I mean, obviously, we just talked about, racial justice issues, but climate, there's so many other areas in which nonprofits are under attack and the causes they care about.
I guess I'll start and just say that I think there's a real need to expand the network of contacts, the amplifiers and validators, and that philanthropy has not only often sat quietly and allowed other organizations to tell their story. They've been negligent in networking particularly to groups and individuals that may not necessarily see eye to eye on certain issues. But, I think in this moment, it's so critical that there are a diverse array of groups and individuals, influential institutions and individuals who understand who you are, what you do, why you do it. And, we're witnessing, and I think we will in the coming months, as I was saying, in, the next 2.5 years, some shifting in political sands, but also a higher level of risk, and on both sides. Again, this is not, particularly directed to one party or one ideology or another. So, how, as a philanthropy and a foundation, can you play a role in both for yourself and for the organizations that you support, bringing others into a space of familiarity? I mean, this was something in the Obama administration, we created these young leader programs across Africa and later other parts of the world. And part of the strategy there was we wanted to get the most influential civil society, business, and government leaders to better understand the United States, better understand, who we are, why, we took certain positions, and it paid off. And it paid off in significant ways, whether it was in response to certain health crises, when it was a response to political crises. And so I think it's important for philanthropic leaders to look at who, not necessarily do I need on a day-to-day basis, but who do I need in those moments of heightened scrutiny, crisis, and let me develop the relationship now. And that could be reporters, it could be political organizations or actors, it could be academics, pundits. And so, really trying to expand now to lay that groundwork. And there's one other point I just want to build on what Abba was saying. I think part of the goal, and we're seeing this particularly so from, there's online influencers who are launching attacks against individuals or organizations. The goal isn't always to affect change. It is to distract. It is to dilute the potency of the programs and what you're doing. So how, again, coming back to that original message, are you prepared not just to go into that reactive posture and to play defense, but to ensure that part of your crisis strategy is playing offense? And by offense, I don't just mean attacking back at them, I mean advancing your work.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Isabella, you want to have a thought?
we
Yeah,
sometimes say, be a friend before you need a friend.
Yeah, that's a wonderful adage.
that's a great statement. And I think that, that resonates completely with me as well. I mean, and I appreciate the philanthropic sector and the challenges that are underway. I mean, it's attack on funding, it's attack and accusations of fraud, it's an attack on donors and board members who might be affiliated with certain people. I mean, there's just multiple. So this defensive mode that they've had to go into is real in protecting. But I think now that there's been, over a year of getting into that defensive mode, planning, I'm hoping to see more of the internal alignments, the alignment within communities more broadly, and rolling out of specific strategies. And I will give an example that's more personal to me. I'm a new board member of the Latino Community Foundation, and in this, aggressive attack against the Latino community on multiple fronts during this administration, there's been a coalescing amongst leaders trying to pull together, strategize, figure out what the best path forward is to protect Latino and immigrant communities in particular. And they've done, lots of convenings, networking, really trying to, align with different institutions to, see where they can find common ground to, protect those communities. And they recently launched a community protection fund to try to achieve that. And so, being bold and being willing to go out there, to raise and focus on a cause, nationwide, really is only possible because of the strong community advocating and networking that they've been doing over the past year, getting into this defensive mode. So, I do believe there's lessons learned there, and now that they're so focused and on a specific framing on a specific goal, they're mission aligned, mission focused, and can be more true to their values, as Abba said earlier, that which is the most important thing, is really building that trust and aligning your values.
Absolutely critical. And I'm glad you brought up the role of board members, because obviously they're so critical in terms of talking about the issues, often incredibly well respected and have amazing networks that they can use to talk about the issues in a way that it's a bit harder for staff sometimes to do it. And so I think we all have to think about making sure that the board members are well informed, well armed, and making sure that they can make a difference. The other people who have been really affected by all of, obviously, the causes and the clients by all these changes, but staff members at nonprofits have felt both very personally attacked and also worried for their safety in some cases, depending on what issues their organizations are dealing with. Some groups have taken off all names of staff members off their websites, been concerned about doxing and other kinds of things. I'm curious what you all have seen and what you recommend in terms of making staff comfortable but still being transparent, and how best to deal with those very real issues that people are very concerned for their safety.
Hmm.
Naba?
That's a good question, Stacy. So I think for what I'm seeing, it is actually economic.
Mm,
So the staff have sort of economic stresses. Whether that is seeing all of the layoffs. We've heard the
yes.
number 300,000 Black women have lost their jobs. Now it's at 600,000, the Black men that have lost their jobs. And so when we're thinking about staff, it is, when we think about a whole person approach, what are they coming to work with? What does home look like? And I think those stresses and pressures, in addition to actually for many organizations, many nonprofits, dealing with the everyday news and the traumas that actually causes. Even while you're having to either prepare or respond to whatever the thing is of the day, you also have a home life that you are also thinking about. And what does that mean when you're seeing your colleagues, your neighbors, your community losing their jobs? And how do you stand in and how do you help your community in that context? And how does that wear on you?
Yeah.
And so
And then how do you speak out and defend your organization when we're talking about things like reputation? It's harder.
it's
Turnout's
harder,
real.
but I think, and that's why this conversation is so important. As organizations, we have to talk about it.
Yeah.
We actually have to have a family meeting and talk about how is this current environment impacting you as an individual. And part of the work is caring, right? And so caring for the work that we're doing internally and externally, I think is something that organizations actually can't and shouldn't shy away from. The work doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so I think to the extent that, we are living our values, as we talked about earlier, those values need to carry across into how we are caring for our staff and also holding space and creating those opportunities for people to talk, for people to share what's going on. I know sometimes we don't want to hear too much, but we do need to create some space for folks to share, as that is part for most organizations, part of our value system, right?
Absolutely. Um, one of the things that obviously is the biggest issue, for organizational survival, aside from these attacks and the policy shifts, is the fact that funding was pulled in so many cases for so many nonprofits. And, it's unclear how much of it is really lasting, but it doesn't matter if you lose a few months of funding for most organizations, that uncertainty, even if it comes back eventually, it's really challenging. And there certainly have been big cuts in federal aid. So many organizations, of course, are turning to philanthropy, asking philanthropy to do more. And philanthropy is saying, wait a minute, we have not nearly the resources that government has. We're a tiny speck compared to the resources of the federal government. And I think that tension, as foundations have been asked to give more and to do more, is part of this reputational issue, because foundations have had, in some cases, to say, we're doing this, but we are not doing that. And some people don't necessarily, they see a lot of dollars in foundation endowments and they wonder why foundations can't do more. And that adds to the reputational issue. So I'm curious if you could each talk about that tension on the funding front of what foundations can do to talk about how they make decisions, how they can be seen as responsive, and the relationship that nonprofits have in this difficult moment to their funding sources.
One thing, again, if you look at crises as openings, opportunities, I think that there, even if a foundation can't um, support more or even the same number of organizations as it had before, how can it enable organizations, especially when it comes to funding sources, to diversify? And we have seen some examples of organizations that have gotten better, whether it's in going out to individual donors, whether it's in becoming more entrepreneurial and thinking about their work. I mean, one of the challenges that I always ran into as a diplomat was we, in many cases overseas, created this lens through which we looked at problems overseas as funding problems. And they weren't always primarily funding. And also, they weren't particularly sustainable if it simply was the US government was providing that funding. And so, this to me offers a moment for some organizations. I know it's not realistic for every organization for all the money that you need, but in some ways to look at. And I think that's where you would find more foundations stepping up to support organizations that are endeavoring to look at diversifying their funding support. The other thing I was going to say to Abba's really good point on looking after your staff is the importance in this moment of bringing all levels of staff into the risk and the crisis planning process.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think what a lot of organizations are seeing is traditionally it has been sort of the leadership that develops the crisis plan, that engages in some of the more involved crisis simulations, whereas the mid-level, in fact, that's really interesting studies about how mid-level management often lacks the knowledge of crisis procedures, plans, even though they're the ones confronting it. And then at the entry level, we're at, that support level where they're often seeing the risks emerging, yet they're not involved in thinking through some of these issues, which then creates a reluctance to elevate issues out of concern. And that includes grantees. I think there's not enough involvement of grantees in that crisis process, even though a grantee in some cases is one of the weaker links in an organization, because anything they do, anything that they don't do could potentially have a blowback on the funder and on the organization. So really trying to be as expansive as you can in that risk and crisis planning process, I think is important.
And one other thing I would add, because this is sort of taking me into this direction, but I was really taken by the risk index results for this quarter, in that a majority of the council members, 87% of them, believe that the philanthropic sector doesn't adequately communicate about its work. And I think you're sort of honing in on that, like transparency of funding and options that decisions that you have to make as leadership, within the limited funds that are available at this moment. But I think the transparency, the communication is more key than ever. And especially if trying to avoid the reputational risk of seeming to abandon your principles, your values. And so, I think it's an utmost challenge. And, I'd really be interested in hearing what Ava has to say about that as well, in terms of how, she's been able to, step up communications, not only internally with staff is obviously being done, but just externally as well, to really provide clarity for folks.
Yeah. It's so interesting because philanthropy needs branding. Um, and when you think about as an institution or organization, the importance of having to explain what it is that you do. right? And Brett was talking about this a little bit earlier. Leverage the moment to talk about what it is that you do and why is it that it matters. Outside of all of the noise, why do you exist? Why are you here? Why does your organization do the work it does? And in the way that it does it? Because people are solving problems in lots of different ways. And I think talking about your sort of theory of change. We use these words sort of in organizations, but you've got to break it down to folks. And what are the outcomes are producing? What is the impact of the work that you're doing? Sometimes we forget that. We forget to talk about the impact. How is it improving lives of real individuals, real people, real communities, real institutions, real systems? We are so good at just heads down doing the work. But right now, I think as we're thinking about trust and maintaining trust or eroding trust, the work is actually talking about impact and finding those places, not just where you have done a thing, but where that thing has actually benefited and is improving the lives. We have seen that there are some foundations that are collecting monies but are not actually distributing those monies. They should be held accountable to that, right? And somebody needs to hold them accountable to that. It is not just enough to sort of talk about the good work that you're doing. It also matters that when you do wrong or when you say, well, we messed that up, for you to say that we messed that up. We didn't do that right. We didn't say that right. We did that at the wrong time. We went too late. We went too that sort of vulnerability increases trust. We as organizations, we are organisms, right? And so it is we don't need to be perfect, but we do need to stand on our values. And when we don't meet that, the best person to call that out is yourself.
Yes.
Because if somebody else writes your story for you, they will not be kind. I promise you that they will not be kind. So I think the lesson in this moment is not only defending the work we do, but being clear about why we do what we do, and holding yourself accountable.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And obviously, philanthropy is involved in, or should be, in a lot of risk-taking efforts, supporting things that are innovative and new, which by definition means some things are going to fail. And it's not because somebody misused funds or anything bad happened. It's because it was an idea that wasn't the right one at that time. And those are the ways that we all learn, and we need to talk about those things. But in philanthropy, we're all very polite to each other. So there isn't always that feeling. And one of the things we've been doing a lot on our site is talking about language and how to do plain language and not how to talk in philanthropy speak, which is a whole different form of communicating that people like to use but doesn't tell the stories. It's not concrete. Nobody understands what it is philanthropy actually does. So really trying to screen and learn how. I'm so glad you focused on that, Ava. Make sure you show the impact in a way that's tangible to people who aren't in your little bubble, and really making sure that happens. I see we're getting questions in, which I'm delighted by. Keep them coming, everybody in the audience. We'll get to them in a second. One of the things that, I think is different probably in the past few months has been all of the focus on the way philanthropy has been involved. In some less than savory instances, the Jeffrey Epstein case is a classic example where people saw philanthropy and philanthropic institutions being misused. Often there were scholars who didn't know that, they should have vetted and done things, and they were excited about their scientific funding and didn't realize it was coming from a source that was questionable. And we've certainly seen many philanthropist names in the Epstein files. There are all kinds of other donor relationships that aren't necessarily always so savory. How is that affecting the view of philanthropy? Is it seen as something that's not trustworthy because of those things that we've started seeing in the press? I don't know who want,
This
Brett, you
is,
want to take that on?
yeah, I mean, I think this is a real definitional moment or redefinitional moment for philanthropy because a lot of, as you described, Stacey, the ways in which Epstein was able to infiltrate, was able to exploit individuals, institutions, particularly philanthropic ones, should be a cause for concern. And it should force some reforms. I think it should force organizations, scholars to be more vigilant, to explore not just who the individual is, um, and do the cursory check, but understanding really what's behind that individual. Why are they looking to engage in that funding as well? This is obviously become a bit of a political hot potato kryptonite. Take your appropriate description of it. And I think it's important for philanthropy to be a leader in this space and to show how, whether it's, political actors and political groups, whether it's, more broadly social organizations, how that both risk of affiliation as well as, the corrosive, corrupting uh, funding can really be an impediment to achieving what an organization wants, what a political group or a social group is involved in. And because philanthropy has the means to engage in some of those structural changes, I think it's incumbent upon philanthropic leaders to really show the way forward in this post-Epstein period. So that's what I would encourage in response to what we've seen so far.
Great. Abba or Isabel, do you want to say anything on that, or you want me to move on to other topics?
We can get to some more questions. I think
Okay,
that
we have a lot of
We can
questions
we can
coming
move
in.
on.
yes,
So
I think you covered it very well.
it was a bit of a nod to say, let's get to some of the questions that the audience has. Um, one of the things that we haven't talked a lot about yet is the concern about AI. And so one of the questioners says, AI misuse tops the risk index for a second consecutive quarter. For a communications or nonprofit leader, what does AI misuse actually look like in practice? And are organizations moving fast enough to address it?
So it looks like misinformation. It looks like other people telling your story, other people co-opting your language, your visuals, your imagery, your stance to twist your words. And so for organizations who are actually trying very hard to talk about their work and their impact, and this climate where there are deep fakes, where there are videos, where there are um, TikTokers who take a thing that you say and morph it into something that it is not. It is very challenging. It is a very challenging sort of environment. But I think for organizations and for communications professionals, it is important to continue to expand um, the channels that we're using to talk about our work, the messengers that we're using to talk about our work. We do a lot of not only reputational or risk, but social listening and like
Mm.
just understanding what the conversation is around the cause or the topics that are most important to you and your organization's values, and not necessarily giving up, but understanding what the landscape is and figuring out what it is that you need to say and by whom. Not everybody is the right messenger, and by whom to try to tackle some of those things. It is, I think. A wild west because there are no guardrails right now, and the technology and the actors are moving at a pace where you have to be vigilant. And I don't know that we have the right guardrails in place. I don't know that we ever will have the right guardrails in place. I think, but for now, that listening and that understanding what is the climate. I sometimes say communications folks are not just delivering, what is the message that we need to say today, but also how will that message be heard, and how will that message be perhaps uh, um, um, misused, if you will, against the thing that we're actually trying to say. So considering all of those things before you speak, I think is valuable.
And I would just, double down on that 100%. It is those reputational risks tied to deep fakes and misinformation. But and now, though, with the way AI has so rapidly grown, and the greater risk is around those lack of safeguards. If safeguards are not contemplated, one of the examples that we called out in the index was, the Grok crisis, where the one-off deep fakes could be reproduced at such a high industrial scale, in their spicy mode, which caused, really a lot of harm to those folks who were pictured. But it's the scale and, the entrenchment that is enabled by AI with its great efficiency. And so, I do think that preparing for response in a quick fashion is really key, but being able to also leverage tools to combat some of the to search and combat some of the misinformation that's out there as an organization.
And it's especially hard because everything's changing so fast that every time you think that you have come up with some ways to protect yourself, there's yet a new kind of threat. So that adds to it. Let me get to some of these other questions. This one is a really important one. So many nonprofits are dependent on government funding. It's easy to say have courage, but does that mean courage to sacrifice the health of your nonprofit by speaking out? And that's certainly a conundrum that a lot of organizations are facing. Who wants to offer some thoughts on that?
So let me say this, because we get this a lot,
I
and
would
there's
imagine.
there's a portion of this that is going back to your principles and going back to your values, and what is it that you actually stand for. If you actually stand for it, it doesn't feel like you're giving something up. When you stand on your values and stand on your principles, I, I think, which is the point of this conversation, I think philanthropy and others will see that and respond to that. The sometimes we think, if we speak, we will not get any more money. But sometimes when you speak, monies come from elsewhere. And I know that is also easy to say, but act in the thing that you say you believe in always. Otherwise, what are you doing? Right? Otherwise, if you're a for profit, or if you're nonprofit for profit, then do that and say what you need to say to get the money, right? Or you're at a moment you're gonna, if the entity, the organization, the political whims of whatever the country is say X, and you don't believe that, and you say, well, we're not going to say anything because we need the money, then you need to sort of check what it is that you're really about. And I'll say that.
Yeah, and I do think, even in the funding on the R&D side, a majority of those dollars that were canceled by the Trump administration were regained, but not regained because of compliance or
Mm.
changes, but because they sued.
Yes,
And so,
exactly.
I don't know what you might gain an immediate benefit by wiping out climate and talking about energy security. I mean, and if it still aligns with, what your goals are, then fine. But I do want to, have everybody remember that it took lawsuits to regain a lot of funding.
Absolutely. And that took courage to be a lot of the organizations that sued had never done that before, but felt they really needed to stand on principle. And it is remarkable how many successes they've had as well. Not that that made it any easier, but they are absolutely winning in court. Um, Another question says, for foundation leaders and nonprofit executives on this call, what's the one thing you'd urge them to do differently in 2026 when it comes to protecting their organization's reputation? Brett, you want to take that one?
Sure. And I'll also just pick up on the last thread, which is I think we've seen a lot of examples to pick on another sector, for instance, in um, the legal space, where law firms, despite all of their purported knowledge of what is and is not legal, those firms, some of the big names quickly caved. And then, later on, found or their competitors found they could successfully challenge it. And so, in the end, some of those other firms, reputationally, I think, stood to benefit from that principled stand. And it is worth going back to the nonprofit, the philanthropic space, to take that longer lens. And so, I guess that is my advice. It's very easy in this moment to look at the storm in front of you. And I would encourage leaders, especially now as we look towards November, as we look towards um, November 2028, what is it, the world that you envision possible could be, and how does that process begin? Because I think one of the things after the first Trump administration that was not done well, both within government as well as on the outside, is the development, the investment in some of those the repair process, in the reinforcement of key institutions and ideals. And so if we learn the lesson from that and we begin the work now, and I think, Stacey, for instance, in the international development space, where USAID has been wiped out, where going to Geneva and talking to the World Health Organization, to other major global development partners who face major cuts, yes, it is absolutely tragic, and the trauma that is being caused, the lives that are being lost, are horrific. And I think at the same time, we need to look at, what does a new model involve? And it may not just be as dependent as it was in the past on government. It may not be the same kinds of programs. And this is where I think philanthropy can really lead.
Absolutely, a whole new rethinking. Um, Isabel, there's a question directly for you. Are there risks in the index this quarter that surprised you, or that you just think the sector isn't taking seriously enough?
Um, well, not that I don't think there were any big surprises. I mean, in some respect, the second risk, which is targeting by the Trump administration, um, it surprises me that um, that hasn't dropped just a little bit. And I'll tell you why. But just because, everyone I think is starting to recognize, especially with different elections in the US, that the pendulum it swings back and forth. And so, I know that there's, fear in being targeted, but I think that there's just such randomness in it that it's being taken less and less serious. And so I will put that out there, that I think, I don't know, and it could be a good thing or a bad thing being targeted by Trump these days. And so, that was one that I'm surprised has hung on so strongly over
Mm-hmm.
these past quarters.
Yeah, I agree with you. It may be a lag effect in some kind of ways, but you're right. Things are moving fast. Abba, there's a question especially for you. Do you have examples of organizations who are focused on living their values and walking the walk in this moment? Anybody that you're looking at and saying, "Wow, they got it right," other than your own organization?
We are trying. I'm not going to name names because that always gets me in trouble. But there are organizations that have leaders who have articulated a vision, who are standing on their principles and their values. There's who are values aligned in how they speak, what they look like on their web, on their social, and their media communications. Isabel started by talking about some of the, many organizations and nonprofits are not these big sort of giant organizations. They are local grassroots. They are mid-sized organizations who are doing well. And I say we should look to them. These the the regional, the mid-sized organizations that are in this moment making a difference in the communities and serving the communities that they have chosen to serve. Um, I don't want to, there's a lot in the climate space that are doing better than most right now. So I'll leave it there.
That's great. You gave us some good ideas, and focusing on local and the community things that people really can relate to is really important. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question if you all can answer it quickly because we're really coming close to the end of our time. Um, and given the increased scrutiny that is happening in philanthropy, somebody wants to know, is that a broader critique of society and institutions? And so can you talk about how funders can meaningfully stand together and for our values, especially when wedge issues are intended to divide us?
Yeah. So let me say one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is pooling resources. There are organizations that are doing work that are focused on like the right now, the immediate.
Hmm.
But actually the funding that they need is X million dollars for 10 years, $100,000 for 5 years, so that they can think beyond the right now immediate need.
Yes.
There's a visioning that is needed, a strategy that they need to build, something that is beyond, what we need to do right now, today, this month, this year, this quarter. And they need the freedom to do that. They need the freedom to think and to innovate and to not be so worried about the right now. I think when philanthropy and organizations sort of come together and pool their money to support organizations doing work and making impact in that way, it will actually help us that much more. The focus on just the everyday survival, I think, hampers so many organizations and hampers so much good that organizations could do. And so, if there was an ask of you, Stacy, and others who are listening, who are in the philanthropic state space, it would be how can we do better to pool resources to help the organizations that are really making an impact look beyond just today and tomorrow, and drive for innovation.
That's an outstanding point. I think we did come to the end of our time with that. Brett, can I turn it back to you to close things up?
Sure, and thank you, Stacy, and to the Chronicle for uh, moderating and for joining us for this. Abba, outstanding to have you, your perspective, and in inspiration as well. I think that is something certainly that I take away. And your last point about pooling, like there is a lot of common cause, and I think we've discovered more of it in the last 14 months or so. And as always, Isabel, fantastic to get your perspective. And, having now been at this a year, I do think we are seeing both some of those trend lines emerge, and that ultimately the goal of this exercise is generating awareness, is starting conversations, reflecting sector by sector. Next quarter, as I sort of previewed, the legal sector will be in our crosshairs. And so we'll be looking at what are some of those reputational challenges facing the legal sector. But in the meantime, do go on the website, both read the report, share it, and start conversations. We look forward to participating in some of those. Again, thank you to our council for their contributions this quarter, and we'll be back in a few months' time.